Hello and welcome to the Smarter Conversations podcast, where we'll be weaving together voices from the cotton supply chain. This podcast is brought to you by the US Cotton Trust Protocol. I'm your host, Kathy Smith. I'm an independent freelance journalist. This podcast series does exactly what the name implies. I'm going to be talking to some of the key movers and shakers in the global textile supply chain to dig into the world of cotton. This is the second episode in our series, and we're focusing on how COVID-19 has affected resilience in the textile supply chain and why we still need a strong focus on sustainability. And of course, supply chain resilience has always been important, but even more so now that we're living through these rather unprecedented times. So joining me today to discuss this, first of all, Arthur Friedman, who is Senior Editor at the Sourcing Journal. Welcome to you, Arthur. Tell us a little bit about the Sourcing Journal. What is it? What do you do?
Okay, good morning and thank you. Sourcing Journal is a leading B2B trade media company and news website that produces publications and events under the Sourcing Journal and Rivet brands. We're a vital resource for the apparel, textile, and footwear industries, delivering essential news articles, expert commentary, and in-depth analysis. My focus as a senior editor is in the areas of raw materials, sourcing, logistics, trade, and economics.
Okay, well, as a specialist in raw materials, you're the right man to have with us today. And I know that the Sourcing Journal recently, together with the US Cotton Trust Protocol, carried out some research to understand the impact of COVID-19 on sustainability initiatives. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. But first of all, let me introduce our second guest, who is Gary Bell. He's president of Chasing Better Consultants in Montreal, I think. Gary. He's former VP Marketing and Communications at Gildan, Canadian clothing manufacturers, of course. So thanks for joining us. Is that right? Are you in Montreal?
Yes, Kathy, I am. The company is based out of Montreal, but I do a lot of work in the U.S., obviously, in the U.S. apparel and textile industry, coming off more than 30 years working for some of the biggest manufacturers and companies in that industry.
So tell us what Chasing Better Consultants is. It's a great name.
Actually, until I saw your question, I had not thought of it in the context of actually chasing consultants. That's not at all what the name means. So it's really basically more talking about the underlying idea behind truly sustainable practices, and that's a notion of continuous improvement. So continuously looking for that next better, and recognizing that ultimately, the sustainability world is not about hitting home runs in American speak, but it's rather about hitting a lot of bunt singles that eventually bring you towards that more sustainable goal.
Arthur, I didn't actually ask you where you are. Where are you?
I'm in northern New Jersey, just outside of New York.
I wanted to ask you, really, how your particular professional worlds have been affected by COVID-19. I mean, Arthur, how has the pandemic impacted you and your work at the Sourcing Journal? I mean, clearly the news cycle has been so dominated by COVID.
Well, I would say the pandemic has changed almost everything about the news cycle. First, our staff went to a staggered schedule to be able to cover the breaking news in a more timely way. So yes, I'm getting up earlier in the morning. The amount of financial and retail news has been tremendous, and the entire supply chain has been impacted. I don't know that the way I or we gathered the news changed, except that it has come at us faster and in greater quantity. The challenge has also been to mix the breaking bad news with the ongoing coverage that we specialize in areas such as innovation and sustainability.
So that's right. I mean, countering the bad news in a way, what sort of stories can compete with COVID? Is it people wanting more inspiring stories, do you think?
Well, it's a combination of things. One, it's pandemic related, and I've written a lot about how the U.S. apparel and textile industry has pivoted their production to making PPE and face masks and things like that. And that's been kind of a good news story because it's been sort of heroic at how they've done it and important for the country. So that's a little bit of good news out of bad news, but we also still, and I'm happy to say that there's been a lot of still stories about innovation and greater sustainability. So the industry hasn't stopped. I'd say maybe it stopped for about a month. And then people said, no, we still have to keep on going and do what we do and think about the future.
Well, there's a good one. The industry hasn't stopped. Well, Gary, we know that the fashion world has been hit really, really hard by the pandemic. I mean, from your experience with brands and retailers, how do you see the picture out there? What's actually going on?
Well, I think to echo Arthur's point, the industry in totality has been impacted. So from a virtual evaporation of demand overnight when the shutdowns happened around the world, obviously that recognized or that highlighted the fact that companies that had been focused on e-com and online sales had some type of a buffer against the closures that happen in brick and mortar and in more of the physical retailing. I think that all of the brands and retailers around the world really quickly had to think about how they're managing their capital. When you have no incoming revenues or very diminished incoming revenues, you need to really quickly focus on how am I going to weather the storm? How am I going to get through this shortfall of capital? Obviously, employees, as Arthur mentioned, rationalization of payroll is a big thing. Changing workplace environments. We're having this call, with people from all around the world. And the concept of remote working, I think that you've seen it with some of the major tech players that, in fact, the notion of remote working isn't a temporary thing. Some of them adopted that as a full-time thing. And I think the other thing is that it's, for a lot of brands and retailers, it's exposed some of the supply chain risks that they have. So, whether it's the relationships that they had with brands and retailers, some canceling, some honoring, some going beyond honoring, to trying to quickly refit, as Arthur mentioned, again, the notion of converting supply chains to be able to deliver to the market what it needs in PPE. But everybody is going to go through that, or has gone through that short-term, immediate, this is what I need to do today to keep the lights on. And now I think as we move forward, they'll be thinking about those mid to long-term thinking about their entire business models. So we're already seeing brands and retailers decide to shutter stores. And simply not reopen a portion of their stores. Some are completely rethinking their business models.
But it clearly, as you describe it, it is not business as usual, and it maybe never be business as usual again. I mean, the world is changing potentially forever. Is there still room for sustainability in this context? Because that's what we really want to talk about today. Because before COVID-19 hit, there was so much buzz about sustainability, but is it still relevant? You talk about companies who are just basically thinking about survival. And I know that, Arthur, you've done some research, as we mentioned before, with the US Cotton Trust Protocol, into the whole business of how sustainability priorities have been affected by COVID. So tell us a little bit about the research and the findings, in fact.
So the U.S. Cotton Trust Protocol sponsored the online survey, and respondents were recruited through Sourcing Journal. They were issued from June 21st to July 5th among 138 senior executives involved in or fully in charge of sustainability decision-making at their company from 8 global markets. I found the Cotton Protocol data fascinating, and that's not always true about surveys, but this really had some very interesting information. It found that 54% of respondents said their customers' demands for more eco-friendly practices and product had either significantly or somewhat increased since the onset of the coronavirus outbreak. And 42% said customers were also more vocal in those demands. So that's some pretty strong results. Maybe less surprising, 59% they said they still believe customers will continue to prioritize price when making purchases. So maybe that's a sign the industry still hasn't changed all that much. But about half of the respondents seemed to believe their customers were more likely to hold them accountable, and for those actions, and that their customers would switch brands if their company didn't meet its sustainability commitments. So that's pretty strong. The survey also found that 43% of those participating believe COVID-19 has had a positive impact on investment in sustainability efforts during the period, although 40% believe it has had a negative impact. So that's somewhat of a mixed bag.
It is a mixed bag. I mean, you talk about consumers being more vocal and expecting higher standards from brands and retailers, but when it actually comes to it, do you think they will kind of walk the talk? I mean, filling in a survey, answering questions, people might say one thing, but in reality, if, for instance, it's going to be more expensive to buy something that is sustainably sourced, are the customers going to do it?
Well, I believe the two aren't mutually different. I think you can have a sustainability strategy and product and still be price sensitive. In fact, it's been proven that sometimes sustainability efforts save companies money, such as using techniques that are water savings or energy savings that are good for the environment, but actually save companies money. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive. And I think that's how companies get to that point of satisfying the consumer, but not making things more expensive.
And you said that you were really interested in the results. I mean, so were you really quite surprised by the fact that sustainability is not slipping off the agenda?
Surprised, yes, not shocked, but surprised because, you would think the basic response would be, I need to get everything cheap. I've lost my job or my income. I don't know what the future is and such. But I think sometimes we have to give the public a little bit more credit in the fact that they do think things will get back to some normalcy and they don't want to lose their integrity.
And Gary, what's your experience of this? I mean, when you're talking to brands and retailers, are you hearing the same story that came out of this survey?
Yeah, I think, in general terms, yes. Obviously, every brand and retailer is facing its own unique set of challenges and is also likely on a different, in a different place on the path towards, driving total sustainability. But I think that, if there's still, the question is if there's still room for sustainability in a post-COVID environment and in this economic crisis, the answer is absolutely. I mean, the underlying forces that were driving sustainability before the pandemic remain in place. Arthur touched on one of them. Sustainable practices are essentially more resource utilization efficient. So if you can get more production out of less inputs, whether you're a farmer, whether you're a textile mill, whether you're a yarn manufacturer, whether you're a garment maker, whether you're a brand and retailer, if you can find a way to actually light your store with 10% less light bulbs, you're essentially saving the environmental impact and also saving money. So I think that those same underlying issues are there. Climate change is not gone away. And I think that consumers are also, being driven with this. We started down this path towards demanding transparency of the brands with which we engage. And I think consumers they're not going to back off of that. So, there's an entire generation of consumers coming into the marketplace that grew up with a cell phone in their hands, that had immediate access to every piece of information they possibly could access. And when a brand says to them, I'm sorry, I can't tell you that about my supply chain, they just look at their hand and say, but I could find it out on my phone in about 10 minutes.
So in fact, trust is really the new consumer currency in a way. I mean, the brands have got to prove their value. They've got to show that they really are being responsible, not just talk about it, but do it.
Absolutely. And I think that, the last point, which was a significant driver of sustainability, which I'm most encouraged about being someone in this field, and that's the fact that investment capital remains highly committed towards sustainability and investing in ESG initiatives. So, and their rationale for doing that is not altruistic. The rationale is that companies that are better performers from an environmental, social, and governance point of view, in fact, deliver better returns. And they're more efficient use. So companies that don't actually perform well, investment capital is now assessing a higher risk profile to them and a lower value. So consumers are the same way. If I'm going to buy a jacket from a manufacturer who has a stellar reputation, who I know is completely transparent, I'll have less inclination to balk at an $800 jacket price. Whereas if it's a jacket that I really don't know that much about their supply chain and a company hasn't been that transparent, I might question the $800 price. So I think we are seeing that, and that's
Yeah.
I see that in those numbers that Arthur was quoting.
Arthur, can I just bring you back in and ask you about the geographical differences here? Because Gary was just talking about how in all sorts of places around the world, everyone's appreciating an increase, improved environmental issues since the pandemic. But did you see much of a geographic split in terms of attitude towards sustainability, either consumers or businesses?
Europe has long been and continued to be the leader in environmental efforts, causes, and particularly in the industry. So I think that hasn't changed. I think U.S. brands are also very environmentally conscious and wanting to have manufacturing facilities that are operating efficiently, but also environmentally sound. And there's been an increase in people wanting to get certified under the various industry certification programs. So I think overall there is a deep desire for greater environmental operations, materials. Fiber companies keep on putting out news, trying to show that they have improved the way they produce, and that's the beginning of the supply chain. So I think it's global and continues to be led by, the Western world, I would say. One key takeaway was that North American respondents were least likely to invest. We're only 26% believe that COVID-19 has had a positive impact on sustainability investment at their company, while in Europe, like I mentioned, 6 out of 10 respondents said the pandemic has had a positive impact on their company's sustainability efforts. And in Asia, 46% of respondents said they believe there have been increases in proactive investments in sustainability initiatives. So it's been a fairly global response, but there is a difference by region.
The US Cotton Trust Protocol, the sponsor of this podcast, of course, just launched in July. And in our first episode, I was questioning the timing of that launch in a way, talking about a new sustainability protocol at this moment. What do you think, Gary? I mean, is it a good moment, or is no moment good for anything at the moment?
Well, I think it's not the perfect moment. If everyone could just snap your fingers and have launched this protocol 5 years ago, I think that we would have loved to have been able to do that. The reality, though, is that the underlying reasons for the protocol and the underlying reasons towards for brands to be pushing towards more sustainable supply chains remain in place. And one of the important ones coming out of the economic crisis that's associated with this pandemic is cost. So brands and retailers will absolutely be facing budget constraints and looking to ways to maximize every dollar they spend. And that's essentially where the protocol is in a position to be able to deliver by providing brands and retailers with verifiable data collected from within the grower's operation. Not only will brands be able to tell their consumers that they're participating in a strong program, but they'll be able to actually give them data talking specifically about greenhouse gas emissions and water consumption and land use efficiency and soil carbon and soil loss, and all really important things when you think about the agricultural side of the cotton industry. And, some of the current programs also require significant investment in dollars on behalf of the brands and retailers, and more significant investment of resources in the programs themselves in order to be able to extract the data they need in order to be able to report to consumers. So, one of the things that Arthur touched on a little bit with respect to consumers, and you did as well, Kathy, is that notion of trust. So, consumers essentially want as much information, especially the younger consumers want more information about where the things they buy come from. And I think that's what the protocol will be able to assist brands in doing, is building that level of trust between the brand and their consumers by providing them actual data. We do have some brands that have already expressed interest in using the data coming out of the protocol to report against some science-based targets. which is a reporting methodology that has a very, very strict set of constraints and methodologies that have to be done and undertaken and verifications that have to happen. And the protocol is in a position to be able to provide that. So I think irrelevant of what is going on, obviously, there'll be an impact on the launch of the protocol. But the truth is that the protocol is probably more needed in the marketplace now than ever.
And Arthur, this need for data that Gary's talking about, is this really vital as far as you see it to be able to build up this some sort of resilience in the supply chain?
I think executives do make decisions based on data, and I think that they need to form strategies based on specific outcomes and what's going on in the industry. So sure, I think that's a part of what decisions are based on, and showing of trends and how certain programs and strategies give results. It's gone from throwing some buzzwords into statements to seem aware, to really developing complex programs from raw materials to how they treat their employees, to being leaders in starting and signing global accords, to from worker rights to sustainability and environmental efforts. So I think the industry as a whole has woken up to it. I'm sure there are still some players that are not the best actors, and hopefully they will realize that it's not to their benefit to act like that. But I think some of the top companies, from Kering to LVMH to PVH and VF Corp in the U.S., major companies have really made concerted efforts and put a lot of funds behind these efforts.
So just looking ahead now, I mean, this is, the inevitable crystal ball type question. And of course, at the current circumstances, there are so many unknowns out there. But just looking ahead to the rest of this year and beyond, I mean, Gary, you already mentioned about investment strategies. Where should brands and retailers be investing for resilience as far as you see it? What should their strategy be?
Well, I think that, again, that'll vary depending upon the situation a specific brand is in. Are they a global brand that has a lot of brick and mortar commitments already made? Are they a brand that is really focused on e-com? I think brands and retailers in the short term are really just going to look to shore up their business models to try and actually stay afloat. And as someone has told me, one of the most sustainable things I can do is just be able to turn the lights on tomorrow morning. And lastly, I think I am confident that companies are going to double down on their commitment to sustainability, because at the heart of that, as I've said before, it's about using resources more efficiently. So whether that comes from the way you actually set up your office, do you need an office when everyone can work remotely from home? An example of using resources more efficiently is just quite simply the use of U.S. cotton. There's a significant amount of research that shows that running U.S. cotton through a yarn mill, a textile mill, or into garments is just more efficient. And the raw material, the cotton, is in fact the largest single component of the cost of producing anything in the apparel world or the home textile world. And if you can draw 2% savings on that largest raw material component or largest component, then essentially you've just reduced your cost and lowered your environmental footprint. So I think that, the win-win of sustainable practices still exists. But I think that, brands are going to rethink, and we'll see a lot of different looking brands going into 2021 with different strategies than what they were previously.
And Arthur, what do you think? How do you think, or maybe the survey told you more about this, how COVID-19 has actually shifted sustainability priorities for the future? Is it raw materials? Is it manufacturing processes? Are there different things that are becoming more important in terms of sustainability?
Well, I've been hearing and writing about how sustainability efforts still matter, maybe even more so during the pandemic. I think it's partly because people have a built-in concern about the environmental impact of apparel and textile manufacturing, which historically has had low marks, but has shown great improvement. I also think the pandemic has caused more concern about what is happening to the planet and whether the next crisis will be environmental instead of viral. So I think a lot of that is going into the thinking of companies. 2 points I think worth noting also in the area of traceability. I've seen a lot of companies putting out news and statements saying how they've joined or been certified by certain organizations that certify from raw material to finished product throughout the supply chain, and how that fits in the area of traceability, and how certifications seem to be more important than ever. I think they give accountability, and it's, if you put a hang tag on a garment that says you're certified by a certain organization, I think that tells the consumer something. And the other area was raw materials. Well, it was maybe a slight decline, but fairly even. And I've seen a lot of companies trying to weave in or turn to more sustainable raw materials, such as cotton, natural fibers, as opposed to synthetics. There seems to be a movement in that direction during this pandemic. Maybe it started just before also, but a fairly strong movement toward natural fibers such as cotton and other cellulosics during this pandemic.
So if I can just make a comment on this data, but I think it's interesting that traceability has gained in terms of importance pre to post-COVID. And I think that's because almost everyone around the world has noticed now how global supply chains are. As we scramble to find sanitary wipes in the stores, as we scramble to find toilet paper, as we scramble to find just things that we daily need, I think it's been illuminated to people, or it's been shown to people just how interconnected and global all supply chains are. So I think it's interesting that that's actually shown up as the one thing that's increased.
Okay, well, just to wrap up it really, can I just ask you both a question? If you were sitting in the boardroom of a big brand or a retailer, and the CEO said, oh, we haven't got the time, we haven't got the budget, we haven't got the people to concentrate on sustainability issues, what would you say to them? How would you convince them? What would you say to them to make them really realize how very important it is? Gary, what would you say?
That's a difficult question to answer. But I would say to them quite simply that to actually have that approach is quite short-sighted. The reality is that sustainability is not a passing fad. Sustainability is a requirement of running a sound, financially successful business, irrelevant of what's going on in the world, whether it's in a COVID crisis. This crisis is very different than the economic crisis that happened in 2008, 2009. But the truth is that in both of those crises, a commitment to sustainability is a commitment towards driving more sound, fundamental business practices that will yield better returns. So I would challenge any CEO that would say that to go have that conversation with his investors, that we're putting our sustainability commitments on hold, and just see what the reply will be from the investment community as well.
Great. Arthur, what would you say?
Well, I would bring out a couple of important points. One is we've all seen over the years the risk of not having proper supply chains from Bangladesh to China to New York City. I've written a lot over the years about factories and such that get caught and risk their image and their company's financial well-being because they don't act in a sustainable, proper manner. So that would not be something wise, I don't think, to do, to not build in sustainable priorities in your company. The second thing is and I think I brought this out before, and Gary may have mentioned it also, is there are ways to actually save your company money by being more environmentally sound and conscious, by using better energy techniques, by upgrading your machinery, by using laser finishes, let's say, instead of water finishes that save money. So you could be wise and avoid risk and still have greater sustainability. So it's just a matter of having the right thinking and the right plan.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Some really good advice from you both there. And thank you very much for being with us today. Well, that's it for this edition of the US Cotton Trust Protocol's Smarter Conversations podcast. Thank you very much to our two guests today, Arthur Friedman from the Sourcing Journal and Gary Bell from Chasing Better Consultants. You can learn more about the Trust Protocol at trustuscotton.org, and you can see more details about the sustainability survey that we've been talking about. So do try to join us again next time, when we will be talking about an upcoming report by the Economist Intelligence Unit, which looks into business and sustainability priorities for leading fashion and textile brands. So until then, goodbye.